The air above the divine realm was thick with an ominous stillness, a silence so profound that it seemed to hold the breath of the cosmos itself. The vast expanse of the sky, once an unbroken canvas of light and serenity, had darkened to an unnatural shade of violet, streaked with swirling shadows that whispered of the storm to come. The gods, those ancient beings who had long ruled over creation with wisdom and power, felt a creeping dread that coiled around their hearts like a serpent tightening its grip. Far above, beyond the borders of the divine realm, Tiamat hovered on the edge of the void, her serpentine form stretched across the vast emptiness like a dark omen. Her eyes, twin orbs of molten fury, blazed as she surveyed the defenses that Marduk had so meticulously constructed. The divine realm was encircled by layers of protection, each designed to repel the onslaught she was about to unleash. But Tiamat's vision had revealed their weaknesses, and now, with her allies at her side, she was ready to strike. Behind her, the forces of chaos had gathered, Uthrog and the giants, their immense forms casting shadows across the stars, Dracora and the dragons, their wings beating a rhythm that shook the heavens, Gorgon and the monsters, their twisted shapes barely contained by the darkness that surrounded them. Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, and Enlil, the storm god, stood with Tiamat, their expressions grim with the anticipation of the battle to come. Tiamat's voice, when she finally spoke, was a low hiss that reverberated through the ranks of her allies, filling them with a cold resolve. "The time has come," she whispered, her words like the slither of scales over stone. "Marduk has fortified his realm, but his defenses will not hold against our combined might. We will shatter each layer, break through every barrier, and when we reach the heart of the divine realm, we will tear down the throne of the gods." The assault on the shield of light. The first layer of Marduk's defense was the Shield of Light, a radiant barrier created by Shamash and Nana, designed to blind and burn any who dared to approach. It encircled the divine realm like a wall of pure brilliance, impenetrable to the darkness that Tiamat commanded. But light, for all its power, was also vulnerable. It could be shattered. Tiamat turned her gaze to Uthrog, the giant chieftain, whose fists were like hammers of stone. "Uthrog," she hissed, her voice filled with cold command, "the time has come to break the light. Lead your warriors into the heart of the shield, and shatter it with your strength. The light will fall, and the way will be open." Uthrog grunted in acknowledgement, his eyes burning with the promise of violence. "The light will shatter," he rumbled, his voice like the grinding of mountains. "We will break it, and the divine realm will be laid bare." With a roar that shook the very stars, Uthrog led the charge. The giants, their immense forms bristling with power, hurled themselves at the shield. The light flared in response, a blinding brilliance that seared the eyes and burned the flesh, but the giants pressed on, their strength fueled by the dark energy that Tiamat had infused within them. Uthrog's fists crashed against the shield, and the light rippled as if struck by a great force. The giants joined him, their blows raining down like a relentless storm. The light wavered, cracks appearing in its radiant surface, as if the very essence of the barrier was being undone by the sheer force of their assault. Tiamat watched with a cold satisfaction as the shield began to falter. "Yes," she hissed, her voice filled with dark triumph. "Break it. Tear it down." With a final, earth-shattering blow, Uthrog drove his fists into the heart of the shield, and the light shattered like glass, fragments of brilliance scattering into the void. The way to the divine realm was open, and the first layer of Marduk's defense had fallen. The taming of the storm. Beyond the broken shield of light lay the storm of wrath, a tempest of unimaginable fury, conjured by Adad and Ninurta, designed to tear apart any who breached the shield. The storm was a living thing, a maelstrom of thunder and lightning, rain and wind, that roared with the anger of the gods. But Tiamat was not deterred. She turned her gaze to Dracora, the ancient dragon lord, whose wings could command the skies. "Dracora," she whispered, her voice filled with a dark, seductive confidence, "the storm is yours to tame. Ride its winds, twist its fury to your will, and turn its power against the divine realm." Dracora's eyes narrowed, his wings spreading wide as he prepared to unleash his power. "The storm will obey me," he growled, his voice like the roar of distant thunder. "And I will turn its wrath against the gods who created it." With a beat of his mighty wings, Dracula launched himself into the heart of the storm. The dragons followed, their forms merging with the swirling clouds, their scales flashing with the light of 1,000 lightning strikes. The storm raged around them, its winds howling with the fury of the gods, but Dracula was undeterred. He opened his jaws, and from his throat issued a roar that shook the heavens. The storm, as if in response to his command, twisted and writhed, its winds bending to his will. The dragons dove and soared, their bodies weaving through the tempest, their power merging with the storm's fury until the line between dragon and storm was indistinguishable. Tiamat watched with cold satisfaction as the storm began to turn, its wrath no longer directed outward, but inward, toward the divine realm itself. Yes, she hissed, her voice filled with dark delight. Unleash the storm. Let it tear down the walls of the gods. With a final, triumphant roar, Dracula and the dragons drove the storm forward, a spear of lightning and thunder that crashed into the divine realm with a force that shook the very foundations of creation. The storm, once a barrier against Tiamat's forces, had become a weapon in her hands, and the second layer of Marduk's defense had fallen. The corruption of the earth. Beneath the raging storm, the earth itself had risen to defend the divine realm. Mountains moved, the ground quaked, and the very stones seemed to come alive with the power of Ninmah and Dumuzi. The earth was a fortress, a living wall that sought to entrap and crush any who dared to breach the storm. But the earth, for all its power, was vulnerable to corruption. Tiamat turned her gaze to Gorgon, the master of monsters, whose very presence twisted the natural order. Gorgon, she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves, the earth rises against us, but it can be corrupted. Burrow deep, infect the ground with the taint of chaos, and turn the very stones against the gods who command them. Gorgon's eyes gleamed with a dark, primal rage, his massive form quivering with anticipation. The earth will rot beneath our touch, he growled, his voice like the grinding of stone. And the gods will be buried in the ruins of their own creation. With a roar that shook the ground, Gorgon led the monsters into the earth. They burrowed deep, their twisted forms tearing through rock and soil, their very presence warping the ground beneath them. The earth quaked in response, the mountains trembling as the corruption spread. The ground, once a solid barrier, began to twist and writhe as if alive, the very stones turning against themselves. Mountains crumbled, the earth split open, and the ground beneath the divine realm became a shifting, treacherous landscape, a labyrinth of chaos that threatened to swallow all who walked upon it. Tiamat watched with cold satisfaction as the earth turned against the gods. Yes, she hissed, her voice filled with dark triumph. Corrupt the ground beneath their feet. Let them fall into the abyss. With a final, earth-shattering quake, the ground beneath the divine realm split wide, a chasm opening that seemed to reach down into the very depths of the underworld. The earth, once a fortress, had become a trap, and the third layer of Marduk's defense had fallen. The domination of the dead. Beyond the corrupted earth, the spirits of the dead had risen to defend the divine realm. Ereshkigal and Nanshi had summoned them from the underworld, a spectral army of vengeful souls, their wails a chorus of despair that echoed across the battlefield. The dead were relentless, their very presence a terror that sought to drive Tiamat's forces into madness. But the dead could be controlled. Tiamat turned her gaze to Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, whose power could bend even the most stubborn of wills. Ishtar, she whispered, her voice filled with dark command, the dead rise against us, but they can be made to serve. Break their bonds, bend them to your will, and turn their despair into our weapon. Ishtar's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening with resolve. The dead will obey, she said, her voice filled with the promise of conquest. And they will turn their wrath against the gods who summoned them. With a gesture, Ishtar reached out to the spirits, her power radiating like a beacon of darkness. The dead, drawn to her strength, wavered in their assault, their spectral forms trembling as Ishtar's will took hold. She whispered to them, her words a seductive promise of release from their torment, a promise of vengeance against those who had bound them to the battlefield. The spirits, once bound by the will of the gods, began to turn. Their wails of despair shifted to cries of anger, their forms coalescing around Ishtar like a shroud of darkness. They no longer fought against Tiamat's forces, they fought with them, their spectral hands clawing at the very fabric of the divine realm. Tiamat watched with cold satisfaction as the dead turned against the gods. Yes, she hissed, her voice filled with dark pleasure. Let the dead rise in our name. Let them strike fear into the hearts of the divine. With a final, haunting wail, the spirits surged forward, their spectral forms tearing through the divine realm like a plague. The dead, once a weapon of the gods, had become a weapon of chaos, and the fourth layer of Marduk's defense had fallen. The fall of the divine. With the defenses shattered, the heart of the divine realm lay exposed. The gods, those ancient beings who had once ruled the cosmos with unchallenged power, now stood vulnerable before the onslaught of Tiamat's forces. The giants, dragons, monsters, and spirits, fueled by the dark will of their masters, surged forward, their combined might a force of unimaginable destruction. Tiamat, Ishtar, and Enlil led the charge, their eyes burning with the promise of victory. The gods, though formidable, were outmatched, their defenses broken, their forces scattered. Marduk, the supreme god, stood at the center of the divine realm, his gaze distant as he contemplated the fall of his kingdom. Tiamat's voice, when she finally spoke, was a cold whisper that echoed through the ruins of the divine realm. Marduk, she hissed, her words filled with a dark satisfaction, your defenses have fallen. Your kingdom lies in ruins. The time of the gods is over. Marduk's gaze shifted to Tiamat, his eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. The cosmos is vast, Tiamat, he said quietly, his voice filled with the weight of eons. And the cycle of creation and destruction is eternal. You may destroy this realm, but the cosmos will endure. The gods will endure. Tiamat's smile was cold and cruel, her eyes gleaming with dark triumph. Perhaps, she whispered, her voice filled with malice. But for now, this realm is mine. The gods will fall, and chaos will reign. The flames of retribution. The divine realm, now a battlefield strewn with the remnants of the fallen, lay in the grip of a deep, unnatural silence. The storm that had torn through the heavens, the shattering of Marduk's defenses, and the onslaught of Tiamat's forces, all had culminated in a desolation so profound that it seemed as if the very fabric of the cosmos was fraying at the edges. The once radiant city of the gods, its spires now crumbling and its streets choked with shadows, stood as a testament to the violence that had torn through the divine order. Before the shattered palace, the gods who remained, those who had not yet fallen to the might of Tiamat, Ishtar, Enlil, and their monstrous allies, gathered in a final, desperate defense. Their eyes were filled with a mixture of dread and determination, their forms battered and bruised from the relentless assault. They were fewer now, their numbers decimated by the fury of the storm, the corruption of the earth, and the betrayal of the dead. But they stood firm, a last bastion of light against the encroaching darkness. Marduk, the supreme god, stood at the heart of this gathering, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the shadows of Tiamat and her allies loomed ever closer. His form was regal, unbowed despite the weight of the battle that had ravaged his kingdom. He had seen the destruction wrought by his enemies, had watched as his defenses crumbled one by one. And yet, there was no fear in his eyes, only a calm, resolute acceptance of what was to come. The gathering shadows. Tiamat, her serpentine form towering above the ruins, led the march of the forces of chaos. Her eyes, once filled with the fierce light of victory, now burned with a deeper, more insidious hatred. The defeat of the gods had been all but certain, each layer of Marduk's defenses had fallen, one after the other, until nothing remained but the final stand of the divine race. Now, with the gods' last defenders gathered before the palace, Tiamat could taste the final victory she had so long desired. Beside her, Enlil, the storm god, crackled with barely restrained fury, his form wreathed in dark clouds that churned with the promise of destruction. His eyes gleamed with the cold fire of vengeance, and his grip on his spear was so tight that the weapon seemed to pulse with the energy of the storm. Ishtar, radiant even in her wrath, stood with a blade that dripped with the blood of the fallen, her gaze fixed on the palace with a deadly resolve. Uthrog, the giant chieftain, Dracula, the dragon lord, and Gorgon, the master of monsters, flanked their leaders, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. The giants, dragons, and monsters that remained were ready to bring the palace crashing down, to finally destroy the heart of the divine realm and tear Marduk from his throne. As Tiamat and her allies advanced, the air itself seemed to darken, the light of the divine realm flickering as if it, too, was on the verge of collapse. The gods who stood in defense of Marduk felt the weight of that darkness pressing down on them, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they steeled themselves for the final assault. But Marduk, standing at the center of his remaining allies, was calm. His eyes, filled with a knowledge that transcended the fear of his companions, turned toward the advancing forces of chaos. He could see the hatred in Tiamat's gaze, the fury in Enlil's, and the cold determination in Ishtar's. He knew that they believed themselves to be on the verge of victory, that they could almost taste the blood of the gods on their tongues. But Marduk had foreseen this moment. He had known that this battle would come, and he had prepared for it. There were laws that even the gods must obey, laws that bound the cosmos in a web of fate and necessity. And it was in obedience to these laws that Marduk had fought, had allowed his realm to be ravaged, his defenses to be shattered. For in the heart of his kingdom, Marduk had prepared a weapon, one that would turn the tide of the battle, one that would burn away the darkness that had descended upon the divine realm. The unleashing of the flames. As Tiamat drew closer, her eyes fixed on Marduk with a hatred so intense it seemed to radiate from her like a dark sun, Marduk spoke. His voice, though quiet, carried through the air with a weight that silenced the howling winds and stilled the trembling earth. Tiamat, he said, his tone calm, almost sorrowful. You have brought chaos to my realm, torn down the defenses that I built to protect it. You have spilled the blood of my kin, broken the bonds that held the cosmos in balance. But there is a force greater than chaos, a power that you have forgotten. Tiamat's eyes narrowed, her form coiling as she prepared to strike. Your words mean nothing, Marduk, she hissed, her voice filled with venom. Your defenses have crumbled, your gods have fallen. The time of the divine race is over. I will tear you from your throne and remake the cosmos in my image. Marduk's gaze remained steady, his expression unmoved by Tiamat's fury. You have forgotten the fire, he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. The fire that was born from the collision of our wills, from the clash of our powers. The fire that I have kept hidden, waiting for this moment. Tiamat's eyes widened, her form recoiling slightly as she sensed the change in the air. The gods who stood with Marduk felt it too, a rising heat, an energy that seemed to pulse from the very heart of the palace. It was a fire unlike any they had ever known, a force so powerful that it seemed to transcend the very laws of creation. Marduk raised his hand, and from the depths of the palace, the fire answered his call. It erupted from the ground, a flame as bright as the sun and as hot as two planets colliding. The light of the fire was blinding, its heat searing, and it moved with a speed and ferocity that left no time for escape. Tiamat had only a moment to react, her eyes widening in shock as the flame struck her full in the face. The force of the impact was like a hammer blow, sending her sprawling to the ground with a roar of pain. The fire seared her flesh, burning away the dark scales that had protected her, leaving her writhing in agony. Enlil, standing beside her, was caught in the fire's path as well. The flames engulfed him, burning away the clouds that had wreathed his form, tearing through his flesh with a ferocity that left him howling in pain. He tried to summon the storm to protect himself, but the fire was relentless, consuming everything in its path. Ishtar, her radiant form now a beacon of despair, was caught in the flames before she could even raise her blade. The fire tore through her with a speed and intensity that left no room for resistance. Her screams echoed through the ruins of the divine realm as the flames consumed her, her body disintegrating into ash and light. Uthrog, Dracula, and Gorgon, those mighty lords of chaos who had stood at the forefront of the assault, were swept away by the fire as if they were nothing more than shadows in the path of the sun. The flames engulfed them, burning away their forms, their strength, their very essence. In an instant, they were gone, consumed by the fire that Marduk had unleashed. The retreat to the underworld. Tiamat, her form charred and broken, struggled to rise from the ground where the fire had struck her down. The pain was overwhelming, a searing agony that tore through her with every breath. She could feel the flame still burning in her flesh, a fire that nothing could extinguish, save the will of Marduk. Enlil, barely able to stand, staggered to her side, his body covered in burns, his eyes wide with shock and terror. "Tiamat," he gasped, his voice filled with a pain that he had never known. "We must flee. The fire, it will destroy us all." Tiamat's eyes, filled with a hatred that burned as fiercely as the flames that had consumed her, turned toward Marduk. She could see him standing at the heart of the fire, his form untouched by the flames, his gaze calm and unyielding. She knew that he had won, that the power he had unleashed was beyond anything she could have imagined. With a roar of defiance, Tiamat turned and fled, her form dissolving into shadow as she retreated to the underworld. Enlil followed, his steps faltering as the fire continued to burn in his flesh, driving him deeper into the darkness in a desperate attempt to escape its reach. The gods who had stood with Marduk watched as the forces of chaos retreated, their once mighty leaders now broken and fleeing for their lives. The flames, summoned by Marduk's will, burned across the battlefield, consuming everything in their path, leaving nothing but ash and ruin in their wake. But the fire did not pursue Tiamat and Enlil into the underworld. As they plunged into the depths of the underworld, the flames ceased their relentless pursuit at the threshold, as if bound by an ancient law, one that respected the boundaries between the realms. Tiamat, her form barely holding together, staggered into the shadowed abyss, her once mighty presence reduced to a flicker of its former self. Enlil followed close behind, his steps faltering, each one a struggle against the pain that still coursed through his charred body. The descent into darkness. The underworld, a place of eternal shadow and cold silence, welcomed them with open arms. It was a realm far removed from the light and order of the divine realm, a place where the boundaries between life and death were blurred, where the spirits of the damned wandered in endless despair. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if the very earth was alive with the memories of the dead. Tiamat collapsed onto the cold stone floor, her body trembling with the effort of holding itself together. The flames that had struck her down still burned deep within her, a searing pain that refused to be extinguished. Her serpentine form, once so fearsome and powerful, was now twisted and broken, her scales blackened and charred, her eyes dimmed by the agony that coursed through her veins. Enlil, his body little more than a mass of burns and scars, fell to his knees beside her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The storm that had once wreathed his form had been snuffed out by the flames, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. He could feel the life draining from him, each breath a battle against the darkness that threatened to consume him. "Tiamat," Enlil gasped, his voice barely a whisper in the cold silence of the underworld. What have we done?" Tiamat's eyes, filled with a hatred that had not dimmed despite her suffering, turned to Enlil. "We were betrayed," she hissed, her voice a rasp that echoed through the empty halls. Marduk, that wretched god, he knew. He knew what would happen. He lured us into a trap. Enlil's gaze fell to the ground, his expression one of despair. The fire, it was not natural. It was something else. Something born from the collision of our wills, from the clash of our powers. We were fools to think we could overcome him. Tiamat's eyes narrowed, her hatred boiling over into a rage that momentarily gave her the strength to rise from the ground. "We were not fools," she spat, her voice trembling with fury. "We were powerful. We had the strength to tear down the divine realm, to destroy the gods. But Marduk, he used us. He used our own power against us." Enlil could only nod weakly, his strength fading with each passing moment. "What now, Tiamat?" he asked, his voice filled with a deep, lingering sorrow. "What do we do now?" Tiamat's gaze turned inward, her mind racing as she considered their options. The underworld was a place of refuge, a place where they could recover from their wounds, but it was also a place of despair, a place where the light of hope was all but extinguished. The forces of chaos that had followed her were gone, consumed by the flames of Marduk's fire. Ishtar, Uthrog, Dracula, Gorgon, all were dead, their power snuffed out in an instant. She was alone now, save for Enlil, and the thought of it filled her with a deep, gnawing dread. But even in her despair, Tiamat's mind refused to give up. She was a creature of chaos, a being of primordial power, and she would not be defeated so easily. Marduk may have won this battle, but the war was far from over. She would find a way to recover, to rebuild her strength, and when the time came, she would return. She would tear down the divine realm, and she would see Marduk and his kin brought to their knees. "We recover," Tiamat said, her voice filled with a cold, unyielding resolve. "We recover, and we rebuild. The fire may have destroyed our forces, but it did not destroy us. We are still here, Enlil. We are still alive. And as long as we live, there is hope." Enlil nodded, his gaze filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "And what of Marduk?" he asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "What if he comes for us?" Tiamat's eyes gleamed with a dark light, her gaze turning to the shadows that surrounded them. "Marduk will not come for us," she said, her voice filled with dark certainty. "He has won this battle, but he is bound by the laws of the universe. He cannot strike us down unless we strike at him first. He will return to his throne, believing that he has defeated us, and he will turn his attention to rebuilding his realm. But we will wait," she continued, her voice filled with a dark, simmering hatred. "We will wait, and we will plan. And when the time is right, we will strike again. We will not make the same mistake twice. The fire will not defeat us again." Enlil's gaze filled with a flicker of hope, his strength bolstered by Tiamat's resolve. "Then we wait," he said, his voice filled with a grim determination. "We wait, and we prepare for the next battle." Tiamat nodded, her gaze turning to the darkness that surrounded them. "The underworld will be our refuge," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "But it will also be our fortress. We will rebuild our strength here, in the shadows, and when the time comes, we will emerge stronger than before. The gods will not know what has hit them. The fire that cannot be extinguished." In the divine realm, the fire that Marduk had summoned continued to burn, its flames consuming the remnants of the battle that had ravaged the kingdom of the gods. It was a fire unlike any other, a flame born from the collision of the wills of the most powerful beings in the cosmos. It burned with a heat that could melt stone, a light that could blind even the most radiant of gods. And it consumed all in its path, leaving nothing but ashes and ruin in its wake. The fire was not a natural force, not a creation of the gods or the universe. It was something more, something that transcended the very laws of creation. It was a force of pure will, a manifestation of the clash between chaos and order, between creation and destruction. And it was bound to Marduk, its existence tied to his will. Nothing could extinguish this fire, save for Marduk's command. It burned with a ferocity that defied reason, a hunger that could not be sated. It consumed everything in its path, stone, earth, flesh, and spirit, reducing all to ash. Even the divine realm itself was not immune to its power, its once radiant spires now blackened and crumbling beneath the fire's relentless assault. The gods who had survived the battle watched in awe and fear as the fire raged, knowing that it was both their salvation and their curse. It had saved them from the forces of chaos, had driven Tiamat and her allies into retreat. But it had also destroyed much of what they had fought to protect, had reduced their kingdom to ruins. Marduk, standing at the heart of the fire, his form untouched by the flames, knew the power he had unleashed. He had summoned the fire as a last resort, a weapon of unimaginable destruction that could turn the tide of any battle. But he also knew the cost of using such a weapon, the price that must be paid for wielding such power. As the fire burned, consuming the last remnants of the battle, Marduk raised his hand. The flames, as if bound to his will, began to recede, their light dimming, their heat fading. Slowly, the fire retreated into the ground from which it had sprung, leaving behind a landscape of ash and ruin. Marduk's gaze swept over the remnants of the battlefield, his expression filled with a deep, lingering sorrow. He had won the battle, but the cost had been great. The divine realm, once a place of light and order, was now a shadow of its former self. The gods who had stood with him, those who had survived, were weary and broken, their strength sapped by the relentless assault of chaos. But Marduk knew that the battle was not truly over. Tiamat and Enlil had fled to the underworld, their power broken but not extinguished. They would recover, they would rebuild, and they would return. The fire had driven them back, but it had not destroyed them. And so, Marduk stood in the heart of the divine realm, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the shadows of the underworld loomed. He knew that the war was far from over, that the forces of chaos would rise again. But he also knew that he would be ready, that he would stand firm against whatever came next. The fire, bound to his will, would remain his weapon, his shield against the darkness. It would burn when he commanded, destroy when he willed, and protect the divine realm from the forces that sought to tear it down. But for now, the fire was extinguished, its flames hidden beneath the surface of the earth, waiting for the moment when it would be needed once more. The aftermath. As the divine realm began to recover from the devastation, the remaining gods gathered around Marduk, their expressions filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The battle had been won, but the scars of the conflict were deep, and the road to recovery would be long and difficult. Nabu, the god of wisdom, was the first to speak, his voice filled with a quiet, reflective tone. "The fire has saved us, Marduk," he said softly, his gaze sweeping over the ruins. "But it has also left us with much to rebuild. The divine realm is in ruins, and our strength is diminished. We must find a way to recover, to restore what has been lost." Shamash, the god of the sun, nodded in agreement, his expression filled with a deep, lingering sorrow. "The light of the divine realm has been dimmed," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the battle. "But it has not been extinguished. We will rebuild, and we will stand strong once more." Marduk's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, his expression unreadable. "The war is not over," he said quietly, his voice filled with a deep, unshakable resolve. "Tiamat and Enlil have fled to the underworld, but they will return. We must be ready for them when they do." The gods nodded in agreement, their expressions filled with a renewed determination. They had faced the forces of chaos and had survived, but they knew that the battle had only been a prelude to the war that was yet to come. Marduk turned to the gods, his gaze filled with a quiet, unyielding strength. "We will rebuild," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of his authority. "We will restore the divine realm to its former glory. But we must also prepare for what is to come. The forces of chaos will rise again, and when they do, we must be ready to face them." The gods nodded in agreement, their resolve solidified by Marduk's words. They had been tested, had faced the brink of destruction, but they had emerged stronger, more united. The divine realm would be rebuilt, and the gods would stand ready to defend it against whatever came next. As the gods began the work of rebuilding, Marduk stood alone at the heart of the battlefield, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The fire that he had unleashed was now hidden beneath the earth, its flames dormant but not extinguished. He knew that the time would come when he would need to summon it once more, when the forces of chaos would rise again. But for now, the fire slept, its power waiting for the moment when it would be needed again. The war was far from over, but Marduk was ready. The divine realm would stand, and the gods would prevail, no matter what challenges lay ahead. In the silence of the aftermath, the shadows of the underworld whispered of what was to come, their voices filled with a dark anticipation. The cosmos would tremble once more, and the battle between order and chaos would continue. But Marduk, the supreme god, would stand firm, his resolve unshakable, his will as unyielding as the fire that burned within him.